Have you ever wondered what it might be like to start a game of Victoria 3 and have countries start with more historic laws? Or see new ones added, or be rebalanced for a better game experience? Or maybe it's literacy and education that really grinds your gears and you'd like to see the whole system reworked, given that every building that we build or resource we take depends on what we have unlocked. Or maybe it's just flavour. You just want more events, more stuff, more historical realism. Well, I've got the thing just for you, and today we're going to take a look at a massive overhaul of Victoria 3, stretching across its politics, its research, its education. Let's just jump straight in, shall we? And I'll give you the context as we move along. First up, this mod pack aims to really break down the research tree. Tiers 1 and 2 have slightly reduced costs, while as you scale through, it becomes more expensive. But it's actually a lot more nuanced than that. You see, the innovation is scaled as well, more reflective of that in Victoria 2, and notably, universities now give less innovation in this version than they used to, considerably reducing the innovation and max innovation base values overall in the process. This is one part an educational reform, but in another part a reform of parties, interest groups, and political movements, and I've decided to cover them both in one video because they're part of the same mod pack, and of course they bleed in really well together. This is the ultra historic series for Victoria 3. Some new, improved, and constantly updating mods. Shout out to the creators. They are of course available on Steam and the Paradox Plaza, but let's get back to talking about what they really do. And while we're on the topic of the education system, looking at it here in Russia, it's important to note that the overarching changes here make it so that educational access from wealth has been reduced. Upper class professionals and intellectuals have a guaranteed base access to education now as well, and literacy also does a variety of other things that have been tweaked and scaled across educations and institutions, but also it impacts a scaling bonus on the military as well, your offense and your defense. So every sort of area of Victoria 3 here is being scaled in some way. And of course, that bleeds into our markets, our buildings, what we actually do to run an economy. And naturally, the education system looks to change universities. And here you can see that universities' size of their outputs and inputs have been drastically downscaled. Interestingly, historical universities, though, are added on map at the start of the game, and clerical educators' production method reduces the innovation and qualifications. So overall, universities have been scaled down. Qualifications, speaking of, we should also probably just quickly note, have been changed here too. Pops are now much slower at learning, and professions have a bigger weight on their qualifications. Social mobility decrees being nerfed, and a few other changes around the edges that give literacy a bigger impact on whether a population is actually able to get their qualifications or not. So perhaps, and kind of leaning into the immersion aspect here as well, trying to create a more balanced and ultra-historical realistic Victoria 3. The changes made to the qualifications, I think, are actually quite a serious impact when you consider how you want to industrialize a country. If you're going to go through an industrial revolution and which production methods you're choosing. So this is not just adding flavor or modifying the game in that way, but it's also adding more nuance to Victoria 3, making it a more in-depth, playable, and of course, it's in the namesake, historically accurate experience. And if, like me, you're gearing up for warfare, here are one example of how warfare could be changed through reforming an education and research system. Because of course, like I alluded to at the start of the game, this is everything. Every single building, production method, arms, gear that you might be importing, exporting, or creating yourself, all of it's been unlocked through the research tree. And with a fundamental change to how populations earn their qualifications, and a much more realistic sense of actually how they earn them, scaling to the research costs. By the way, ahead of time research penalties have been drastically increased in this mod, and later technologies, tiers 4 and 5, have been considerably increased as well. The idea here is to provide an ultra realism, and I think that this mod, even though it's quite new, does a good job at doing that. But of course, as I mentioned at the start, it's one piece of the puzzle, and what I hope turns into a massive overhaul of every system in Victoria 3 combined into one. And from my experience, the mod packs of course work very well together. But as I alluded to, it's about more than just education. And as you saw at the start, there are significant changes to the legal system too. We'll look at Russia's, and then we'll also look at the UK as a slightly contrasting example. You can see that laws across the board have been rebalanced to be both more realistic and have more meaningful effects. And you can see me take a look through the economic laws, obviously some of the most significant ones, and how different investment pool contributions and other yields change. I expect that the base game will change investment yield contributions moving forward as well, but it's nice to see the modding community looking at different kinds of values. Countries also start with their historic laws, which is great. I haven't checked all of them, but it's a nice flavour change. And also laws tend to have more dynamic effects on interest group attraction and political movements. Speaking of which, movements are stronger and longer, just like how all of us want to be. Revolutions themselves, by the way, have become more threatening, which actually probably makes it a good time to move over and have a look at some British gameplay where a South Australian religious revolt has broken out. Now, of course, this one, not especially threatening, right? But in larger nations and in more impactful areas, sorry to my cousins across the ditch, this really plays out. Moreover, radicalism is more impactful and more powerful, and the mod packs also increase the minimum and maximum interest group opinions from currently enacted laws. So it's strengthening what they do. It's making radicals more extreme, revolutions something to be afraid of, and it also isn't afraid to mess with the AI a little bit here too, making it likely to cave to political movements to avoid civil wars as well. So it's not just the single player here. The changes overall make movements more dangerous and something to be feared. So, with rebellions and interest groups sort of chomping at our heels and being more powerful than ever before and having a more significant role to play, seems like a good time to actually think about those people within our economy, right? The interest groups are the people who are playing it out for us. These changes to the interest groups do a really good job at making countries feel more unique and also changing how ideologies play out over time to provide a little bit more historical realism. For example, interest groups are overhauled. The parameters around them and how people will be attracted to them now specify depending on the country that you're playing. Certain groups, like conservative ones, are less likely to be marginalized earlier on and could form powerful blocs later, and other interest groups like industrialists can grow more conservative as liberalization occurs, ensuring that the conservative opposition stays throughout, something that is notably missing throughout Victoria 3. One example is that multiculturalism, one of the laws, of course, that is influenced by ideologies and interest groups, naturally, is now something that can only be supported by far-left leaders in the Victorian era, which is, of course, where we're playing, specifically in the later game. One small example of how these changes play out. They, of course, play out on the political party level as well, which has been similarly overhauled to kind of support what the system's putting down. Political party formation allegedly makes more sense, and that's done throughout a variety of ways to how they actually play in the game. Makes them a little bit more meaningful, which is great. And while large parties can still exist, it does tend to, and I agree with the mod makers here, happen in a more logical way. Legitimacy has been rebalanced, something that the devs have been rebalancing forever in value and effects depending on laws. Elections are allegedly less random, so more logical depending on interest groups' clout and on leader popularity, so kind of bringing some realism in. And then finally on the parties front, though, will be more dynamic over time depending again on those critical ideologies that have also been reformed as part of those interest group changes. And wider geopolitics, the historical flair and diplomacy also receive some brief but fantastic adjustments. Declared interests are reduced across the board, the AI is less likely to intervene in diplomatic plays, and malaria is easier to spot, but crucially, the overall approach to colonialism has been slowed down a little bit. The scramble for Africa now more realistic and less likely to happen far too soon. And if we think about some of the other changes, like changes to laws, with the colonial exploitation law being harder to enact without having unlocked the new imperialism ideology, which places it in the mid to late game. And of course, this is set on top of some extra historical flair, from French politics through to nationalist uprisings in Austria around 12 years after game start. The Germans and the Italians receive more flavour around their unifications, and hopefully this is just the start. Thank you very much for joining me in this mod spotlight as we take a look at the ultra-realistic mod series for Victoria 3, looking at the diplomacy, looking at these laws, distribution of power, and as I mentioned at the start, these changes do impact everything. Yes, this is an economy game. Yes, it's about buildings and production methods and trade and all of that good stuff. But behind that, of course, is the people, the populations, the interest groups, and the laws which will fundamentally make or break an economy. And so far, the ultra-realistic mod series, as you can see, does a really intricate and detailed job at changing that. I'm looking forward to seeing how it progresses moving forward. Thanks for watching.